This is Judaism Unbound, episode 511, Antisemitism Beyond Eternalism. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we're exploring the topic of antisemitism. It isn't the beginning of a full-fledged series of episodes, but it's the beginning of an ongoing exploration of a topic that's on a lot of people's minds these days. It seems there's a broad agreement that antisemitism is an important issue, but a lot of disagreement about how it should be defined, what its impact is, which direction it's coming from, and how concerned we should be looking towards the future. We're starting this exploration today with Daniel May, and then next week with Sarah Hurwitz, and we think they'll help us begin to map the landscape of today's thinking on this important topic. Our guest today, Daniel May, is the publisher of Jewish Currents, which describes itself as a magazine committed to the rich tradition of thought, activism, and culture of the Jewish left. Daniel May has been a mainstay in conversations about American Jewish politics for over 15 years, and he recently wrote a piece in Harper's Magazine entitled An Outrage to Common Sense on the meanings of anti-Semitism. So in today's episode, we're really excited to jump in and explore his take. But before we do dive in, Lex, can you share this week's Judaism Unbouncements?
I 100% can. We have some wonderful things coming up. First, we've got on December 12th, Shabbat Unbound, our next convening of our year-long Shabbat service. It's going to be a lovely time. You can sign up for it by heading to judaismunbound.com/Shabbat. We'll be diving into the prayer Psalm 92, which is kind of like that moment in the movie where the title of the movie is named. It's the psalm about Shabbat, so get jazzed about that. We also have Apocryphest, our annual initiative in partnership with the Torah Studio. You can sign up for our Apocryphest emails during Hanukkah by heading to judaismunbound.com/apocrypha, APOCRYPHA. And you can also sign up for our Zoom gathering, our Hanukkah candle lighting, that will be taking place on December 21st, the last night of Hanukkah, and the first of the month of Tevet, Rosh Chodesh Tevet, which is actually a really important day in some apocryphal books. So we hope to see you there, and I'll pass it back to you, Dan.
Thanks, Lex. And now here's a little more background about our guest today, Daniel May. In addition to serving as publisher of Jewish Currents, Daniel May teaches courses at Hebrew Union College ranging from American Judaism and Social Justice to the crisis of Zionism to Jews, Judaism, and race. Daniel May holds a master's degree in theological studies from Harvard Divinity School and a PhD in religion, ethics, and politics from Princeton University. In addition to his academic work, he has over 2 decades of experience in community labor and political organizing. Daniel May's academic research is in 20th century Jewish political thought with a focus on Jewish liberalism, nationalism, and social movements. His scholarly work has appeared in the Jewish Quarterly Review and The Good Society, and he's also written for Reform Judaism magazine, The Nation, Tablet, Haaretz, and Jewish Currents, along with Harper's Magazine, of course, which published the piece that will be central to our conversation today. So without further ado, Daniel May, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, we wanted to have a couple of conversations with folks about anti-Semitism because it's a word that's being used a lot lately. It's a concern that a lot of people have, and it's also a concern that a lot of people are saying you shouldn't have. We thought that rather than kind of getting into this space of arguing about it, we wanted to have some thoughtful people on who could help us think about how to think about this question, because it's obviously important because people are concerned. And I'm talking about within the Jewish community. You know, there are people that are saying there's so much anti-Semitism, and there's other people saying what you're saying is anti-Semitism is not anti-Semitism. And it seems to me that it's resulting in a lot of people dismissing one another because they're basically saying, how could you possibly think the other thing? And so I'm wondering, as somebody who's a thinker and helps situate some of these conversations in ways that hopefully people can actually be thoughtful about, that maybe you could help us sort some of this out. And how should we start to think about this question about anti-Semitism in the moment that we're now in?
Well, that's a very big question. And In some ways, I feel I've been involved in Jewish politics and organized around Israel Palestine for most of the last 15 years. I did a PhD in religion with a focus on modern Jewish thought and history. And so my engagement on these issues is as a reader, as a, somebody who's in these conversations, but not as a scholar. But if you are in the kinds of conversations that the two of you are in, that I'm in, this is one of the major areas of concern and demands, I think, a lot of attention. And if that was true, and I guess just to start, I mean, I guess I would say that I think it is altogether appropriate that people who belong to the Jewish community are concerned about anti-Semitism. It would be a little odd if folks were not concerned about the persecution and discrimination of one's own people. So I think that that's just to start as like a basic, I don't know, disclaimer. And then I think seeing the way that anti-Semitism particularly has been used over the last 6 months, last year by the Trump administration as a tip of the spear in their assault on civil liberties, on academia, on the Palestinian solidarity movement, on free speech, should make the topic an area of concern for anybody who is committed to the fledgling democracy that we're part of. And then, the occasion for our conversation, I think, is this review essay I wrote on Mark Mazar's terrific book on anti-Semitism, which to my mind is one of the best books that I've read on the topic. Fantastic history of how anti-Semitism emerged as a political force in the late 19th century and the way that it's shifted over times as a political force over the last 150 years, leading up to what we're seeing today.
My wife has this idea, which I think is very cool, which is that there should be a Jewish community version of the game Taboo, where it's a game, right, where you have to guess a word and you're not allowed to say 5 particular words as you're trying to get people to guess the word that you're trying to say. So she's saying, could we have these Jewish communal conversations without the words that seem to trip people up because they have different definitions of them? And that's actually a big core to why we're arguing. And somebody else, I think Daniel Hartman, said recently, like, a lot of this is it's turning us into a nation of lawyers where we're all arguing over, well, does it meet this exact definition or that exact definition? And we're not talking about the thing that we should be talking about, which is something really bad happening, whatever name you want to give it. And of course, words and names also have utility and power. So I'm not making the argument that we shouldn't use these words at all. But I do think the thought experiment is interesting that says, what if we weren't allowed to use particular words? Would we be able to talk about what we're trying to talk about?
And you're getting at like Zionism or anti-Zionism or apartheid or
sure,
genocide.
I'm talking about Zionism,
those kinds of
anti-Zionism,
words.
genocide, apartheid, and anti-Semitism, right? Among probably other words that I'm forgetting right now. And so, but I don't want to not use the word. I do want to use the word anti-Semitism in this case, but I also want to try to get behind it and understand what it is that we're concerned about, whether maybe some of the things that divide us are that different people are concerned about different things. And so I'm just kind of wondering whether the word anti-Semitism is such a big category that it almost defies conversation because different people can mean different things by it, and history allows them to mean different things by it. So if we are trying to talk about anti-Semitism in a way that's more helpful, how might we do that? And where do you think the weight of our conversation should be?
The way that I think about this is that historically, as a political force, anti-Semitism in the modern period, by that I mean post-French Revolution in the late 18th century and then developed through the 19th century, was about the myth of Jewish power that was responsible for various kinds of modern ills, whether those were the ravages of industrial capitalism, the emergence of nationalism and the forces that were threatening that nationalism. Presenting the Jews as responsible for all of these conditions is the central hallmark of modern anti-Semitism. So it's about the inflation of Jewish power. Now, we can talk about anti-Judaism, the long history of Christian prejudice towards Jews throughout Christendom, which had a very different set of dynamics at work. It was also at times violent, of course, through the Crusades. But it was not, it had nowhere near the kind of political force and nowhere near, of course, the violent ramifications of modern anti-Semitism culminating in the Nazi genocide. But modern anti-Semitism is about the inflation of Jewish power. Now, what gets so complicated is how do you think about anti-Semitism in a moment of immense Jewish power, which is just a reality that we are living in, where there is a state that describes itself as the Jewish state that is by far the strongest military in its region. How do we talk about Jewish power in a moment when there are very significant lobbies that describe themselves as representative of the Jewish community that have enormous influence on our political life? We are living in a moment of unprecedented Jewish power, both in the center of America, which remains the, world's superpower for the time being, and in, of course, close coordination with America in the Middle East. So what's so challenging is how to think about this dynamic, which again is based on an inflation of Jewish power at a time of intense Jewish power. And the thing that is so damaging and so politically corrosive is the way in which criticisms of Jewish power get dismissed, obscured, denied by labeling them as anti-Semitic. That's the dynamic that we're in. I think that's the source of the controversies, confusions, manipulations of the term.
So let's get into some of the elements of that piece you mentioned, the Harper's piece, and it's in the show notes for those who want to pause and read it, or those who just want to be able to check out particular little moments that we allude to. There's a lot that I really appreciated about it. And one piece, you give some historical analysis, not dissimilar from what you just gave. You use a word that I hadn't seen before. You talk about how certain folks, and you mentioned particular books that are not this one you liked, but you talk about this eternalist argument. I had never heard eternalist as an adjective. The closest I think I've gotten is like the Eternals as a noun in like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But you distilled something that I think is so pivotal. And it's one of those things that's so core to how many of us have been taught to think about anti-Semitism that we don't even think it's a thought. Like it's just the water we're swimming in. And that thought is that anti-Semitism is, and I'll use like an annoying academic word, but transhistorical. That anti-Semitism, its existence kind of was, is, and will be throughout history. And I like that you used was, is, and will be, because for many Jews, they'll recognize that folks talk about the name of God, Yud He Vav He in Hebrew, as a sort of combination of was, is, and will be. This notion of anti-Semitism always existing, no matter the historical context, no matter the geographic context, it is kind of a faith belief. It's a faith belief that when you hold it, leads in all sorts of directions, but they're not inevitable directions. And indeed, there are many moments where we look at our historical past where lots of Jewish groups have not believed that anti-Semitism is kind of transhistorical, and they've set out to eradicate it. But today, we've got a lot of organizations that their framework is around anti-Semitism basically being something that is just part of the wallpaper. It's there. So eradicating it is not really the quest. And then the question is sort of what we do. And I'm curious if you can take us into that. Like, what is this eternalist argument and why might we want to question it?
I think you put that extremely well. And you point to one of the great ironies, which is that the organizations today that make the most amount of noise about anti-Semitism are the same organizations who fundamentally believe that anti-Semitism cannot be defeated or eradicated because of exactly what you just said, which is the idea that anti-Semitism, the meaning of which, according to this argument, is the hatred of Jews. And Jews have always been hated. They were hated in ancient times. They were hated in European Christendom. They were hated in the Arab world, and they're hated today. And as Chuck Schumer in his book on anti-Semitism put it, it just is and it always will be. And as you note, that is a religious idea. The idea that there is some phenomenon that is eternal is a faith commitment. It is not a historical commitment. It's not a political perspective. It's a claim about the way of the world that always has been and always will be. And that remains today the dominant view of anti-Semitism. And it is profoundly ahistorical and anti-intellectual. One of the things that makes Mazauer's book so great is that he begins by framing his entire argument as a response to this eternalist framework, which I think does at least in the Judaism in which I was raised, it's a kind of barely secularized religious idea. This is what it means to be Jewish, is to have this faith commitment. And the faith commitment is we will always be persecuted. And so how do you respond to that? Well, again, the irony is if that's your starting point, there's not a whole lot of response that makes much sense, right? It's only a matter of pointing it out and demanding witness when it arises. And that is the basic strategy of most organizations that are combating anti-Semitism.
And you put that in quotes. People can't see that, obviously, but you had combating anti-Semitism in little air quotes.
Yeah. And one of the, if you look at somebody like Barry Weiss, right, what is Barry Weiss's antidote to anti-Semitism that she concludes her book with? Well, it's be more Jewish, be publicly Jewish. That doesn't make any sense as far as like a political program, right? It's only a kind of call to arms and a call to pride and kind of acceptance, but in making ourselves, more visible in witnessing this persecution. And one of the things that Mark Mazauer does very well in describing how at a certain moment in the beginning, really in the 80s and 90s, various organizations came to see the ways in which campaigning around anti-Semitism made for good organizational politics, in the sense that it led to all kinds of organizational growth and publicity. And I do think it's hard not to get a little bit cynical about the ways in which organizations use fears around anti-Semitism to serve their own organizational interests in ways that very clearly don't make much sense strategically in terms of moving any politics. And obviously the clearest example of this is, the ADL, which will, in various ways offer kinds of cover to the same right-wing parties and politicians that platform overt. Elon Musk would be the most obvious example of this, where, you see organizations that are, on one hand, raising alarm about anti-Semitism in ways that make no political strategic sense, but make a whole lot of sense in terms of their own organizational interests.
The ADL is an interesting point. The way we talk about certain Jewish communal projects and their, to use your air quotes, combating anti-Semitism, for me, it's important to say, I don't have a problem with the ADL and others because they're doing a bad job of fighting anti-Semitism. I do think that's like a poor use of resources for folks who want to be fighting anti-Semitism to put it into projects that are not doing a good job. My bigger problem is that I actually think they are actively endangering Jews. They're doing more than just mobilizing an analysis I think is failing. In doing the work they're doing, which is often conflating, as you said, criticisms of Israel, criticisms of Jewish power that merit discussion in our world with automatically anti-Semitism, they are helping to, obviously, all of the dangers of victim blaming arising. I'm not saying Jews create anti-Semitism. I do think that there are things that happen in the world that folks who despise Jews can easily use to harm us. And so the reason I say that is because, going back to what Dan asked at the beginning, I share your response of I don't want anybody not to be concerned about anti-Semitism. I don't regularly interact with folks who are saying that we should be unconcerned about anti-Semitism. What I more commonly find is that the ways we are concerned about anti-Semitism that have the most funding behind them, that have the most institutional apparatus behind them, are unsuccessful or maybe actively part of the problem. As I analyze not just the ADL, but many organizations right now, and I look not just at what they describe in words as anti-Semitism, which I have problems with, they're often supporting definitions I disagree with, but also forgetting what they say they care about and looking at what they actually spend their time focused on. The predominance of what they're doing is looking at folks advocating for Palestinian rights, whether it's on college campuses, whether it's in urban centers, wherever it might be, calling what's happening strong language, including genocide or apartheid, and at the very least saying those are the people to be nervous about. And they're saying, they're turning, in my view, the gaze of where the camera should be from folks who are very actively, maybe I haven't said this on the show before, every single week, when we drop an episode of Judaism Unbound, we do an $18 Facebook ad, a little cute $18 Jewish shout out. And that helps our episodes become visible to more people. And every single week, we get a flurry of comments from people that actually hate Jews. That like very directly, explicitly, they put little comics that are offensive. And by the way, social media does nothing to prevent this as much as Facebook will say that it wants to fight anti-Semitism. And these people, I mean, a lot of them don't like Israel for sure, but they are saying explicitly, like, we think Jews are evil. They're using very old school terminology and offensive slurs. And then I go to the pages of whatever publications, and I learn that the places to be worried about are people peacefully protesting on college campuses with Palestinian flags who include Jews among their ranks. Now, are there some of those folks who also hate Jews? Yeah, I think there probably are. But systematically, there is a corner of our society in the United States of America that has anti-Semitism fundamentally undergirding it.
Right.
And I would like organizations to focus on that. So when the ADL and others don't, I feel like they're more than failing. They're actively sort of moving our lens to where it shouldn't be.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly co-sign all of that. I think one of the real ironies that emerges when reading the history of Zionism and its emergence in the context of anti-Semitism and the early debates over Zionism is you see how odd it is that today anti-Zionism is considered inherently anti-Semitic. Because Zionism is in many ways, when it emerged, the mirror image of anti-Semitic argument. And Mazar, I think, makes this extremely clear in his book. And when I say that, I mean, of course, Zionists did not think that, Jews were subhuman and did not believe in the myths of, a Jewish cabal controlling the world. But the conclusion of the anti-Semitic arguments were Jews do not belong in our country. They should never be considered equals, and they can never be considered equals. And Zionists accepted that argument. They accepted the basic argument that Jews were not going to be equals in France and Germany and Italy, and we could go down the list in Europe, and they were going to be foreigners, and they were always going to be foreigners, and they needed their own country. So in that respect, Zionists embraced and accepted the fundamental anti-Semitic argument. Now, to give just one example of how this shows up historically. So when Herzl proposes the first Zionist Congress, his initial proposal was to hold it in Munich. And the Jewish community in Munich, both the Reform rabbis and the Orthodox rabbis, who were in constant argument with each other, they all signed a letter together opposing the Zionist Congress happening in their city. And the reason was because they argued that it undermined all of their work on behalf of Jewish equality and Jewish civil rights in Germany. How is it possible for us to campaign that there should be no requirement for religious Christian affiliation for public office if you are saying, oh, in fact, we are not Germans, we will never be Germans, we are Jews and we will always be foreigners and we are our own nation and we need a separate national home? Well, if that's the case, then it's appropriate for Germany to require Christian affiliation for public office because we're telling them we are not foreigners. So there was a mobilization by the entire Jewish community against Herzl for the ways in which the Zionist project was undermining the central liberal case for Jewish equality, Jewish emancipation, Jewish civil rights in Europe. Now, of course, the disclaimer that must be said when addressing this argument is in many respects, and maybe one could argue in the fundamental respect, that history proved the Zionists right, in the sense that it turned out Europe, almost as a whole, would not and did not allow for Jews to be members of the national communities of Europe. They were considered foreigners. They were easily ghettoized and then exterminated. So there's a way to read the history to say, well, the Zionists were right about their analysis of European politics. And I think that there is a truth in that and a lot of truth in it. The central problem is what they were right about, what the Zionists were right about was the nature of European nationalism. The nature of European nationalism was such that, yes, France, given its understanding of itself and French nationality, did not allow for Jews to be full participants in the French nation as it developed. That was true across Europe. The central problem is the Zionists embraced that political structure when shaping both conceptually and politically the nature of the Jewish state. So in the same way that Italy made no room for non-Italians, the Zionist project makes no conceptual rooms for non-Jews. So the irony of Zionism, and irony is far too soft a word because this has massive violent implications for, of course, for Jews and then today for Palestinians and over the last 100 years for Palestinians. Zionists were absolutely right about their criticism of European nationalism, and they embraced that model wholeheartedly in the politics that they created in the land of Israel. You see the degree to which the Zionist project embraced and accepted the basic framework of the anti-Semitic politics that they were reacting against.
I want to preface what I'm going to ask, sort of my view of what Judaism Unbound has always been about for the last decade, is to encourage people to think for themselves and to not believe what you're hearing from the powers that be that might have, interests of their own. And so I want to stipulate to that. I want to try to get not locked into the conversation that says, hey, don't listen to this side because they have interests and you're a chump for listening to them, because you could say the same about the other side. I really want to look at this question sort of, from first principles and just kind of ask, like, what is really going on? So let's, I'm thinking about, for example, David Nirenberg's book, Anti-Judaism. And the subtitle of his book is Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition, right? And his argument is anti-Judaism is built into the Western civilization, into everything, because it was basically built in formatively to Christianity. I mean, it also predates that, but that it was built in. And by the way, this was an argument that I remember hearing all the time 10 years ago when we were starting up Judaism Unbound from my friends to the left of me. They were all talking about Christian hegemony and how anti-Semitism is sort of built into the fabric of Christian hegemony, and we have to be concerned about it coming from, quote unquote, the right, but really that it was more than the right, that it was built into our society. And now I feel like I don't hear my friends on the left talking about that so much anymore, because what they're concerned about is what's going on with Israel. And I mean, rightly so, but I feel that maybe this is just the way people are, that the concern with what they say, and I agree, are often claims of anti-Semitism from the left, so to speak, or let's say from the pro-Palestinian world, that those claims of anti-Semitism are overmade, that there may or may not be some anti-Semitism, just like you said, Lex. Like there may or may not be some people in those groups who hate Jews, but for the most part, that's not what these movements are about. And since they feel part of those movements, they are very interested in saying it's a different nature of a thing because they don't have the kind of power that these institutions have, all of which has truth to it. But I guess like where I find myself struggling, and I'm not really interested in a struggle between the left and the right. What I'm interested in is the mass of Jews. I mean, I'm interested in non-Jews too, but I mean, for this conversation, I'm interested in the great mass of Jews, which I believe are what we might call left of center, and are neither part of the far left and are certainly not on the right. And I feel like I'm seeing a lot of people that are to the right of me, but have thought of themselves as people of the left, Democrats, right? I mean, who never would in a million years think about themselves as people on the right or Trump supporters or anything like that. I'm hearing a lot of those people saying, I just see this anti-Semitism, and they'll give all kinds of examples, right? I mean, and we could go into some of the examples if you want, but they'll give all these examples and they say, if the people that are farther on the left are denying that there's anti-Semitism that's worth considering or that's worth being concerned about coming from the left, then I just know that they're wrong. I see it for myself, and I guess they're as dishonest as you're saying that the ADL is. And whether or not that's true, I feel like that's what I'm hearing from these people, and they're becoming increasingly alienated from exactly the things that I think we all agree that we don't want them to be alienated from, such as caring about Palestinian lives. Like, it's not saving lives. It's risking lives because it's pushing away a lot of the potential support for that position by sort of denying it altogether. And I'm wondering, another thing that Lex and I have talked about a lot is like, it's not tshuva, it's not atonement if you're only saying that the other side should atone. I'm wondering from your perspective, like, are there things that could be done better on the left in terms of how we talk about anti-Semitism, and maybe beyond that, how we talk about Israel-Palestine, that might be true to the values of the left, but also more likely to succeed in terms of a strategy of whatever, you talk whatever you think the strategy is and ought to be?
Yeah, several things to say in response. I mean, I think this is a very big question. And I think ultimately what you're asking is, what is the left strategy when it comes to anti-Semitism that goes beyond simply saying that it is a misdirection in order to deflect from the violence, brutality, and killing unfolding in Israel-Palestine? So I do think that there is a real need for a much deeper analysis and understanding and framework on the left for thinking about anti-Semitism and how we address it. That's number one. Number two is, I think that it has been very frustrating to see over the last 2 years the way in which so many in the Jewish community have accepted a story of increased anti-Semitism on the rise. That has coincided alongside a genocide perpetrated by the Israeli government and supported by the vast majority of Jewish institutions. And I do not think that that is a coincidence. I think that the efforts, however intentional or not, to consistently and relentlessly raise the alarm about anti-Semitism in America, anti-Semitism on college campuses, have served to deflect and obscure the war crimes that the same institutions that are raising that alarm are supporting either tacitly or implicitly. The conditions that that creates are such that it becomes very hard for somebody who is, I would say concerned, but that's too light a word to talk about the destruction and decimation that has unfolded in the last 2 years. A week after October 7th, there was an order of evacuation for 1 million people to leave their homes. Over 90% of families in Gaza no longer have homes. The numbers in the 70,000s, I'm sure it's going to be much higher than that. We could go down the line about the massacres and killing that have unfolded over the last 2 years. And so when you look at an incident, just to take one example, of somebody outside the gates of Columbia holding up a sign and screaming, "Jews go back to Poland," is that anti-Semitic? Absolutely. That same day, we could look at the calendar of how many Palestinians were killed that same day, and it becomes very hard to figure out how to morally respond to that wacko on the side of the street in Upper Manhattan when the killing that is unfolding is of such dramatic, disproportional harm. And so to even respond to the anxieties and fears that some people may feel about that sign seems to, not just seems to, but enables a framework in which that is taken as the source of concern. Now, should it be a source of concern? Yes, absolutely. But is it a genuine moral problem to figure out how to respond to that concern alongside massacres that are unfolding? Yes, I think it's a genuine moral problem. And I think the idea that like the left has not been sufficiently attentive to these, concerns and anxieties about anti-Semitism and is constantly just saying that their strategy of deflection, I think that really understates the genuine moral and political problem of how to figure out how to respond in good faith to certain circumstances that should concern us, but that are in a given moment so far down the ladder of what is of most urgency. So I think that's the broad framework in which I want to try to respond to the correct analysis of what is wanting after years of being caught in these conditions, which is any kind of robust strategy for speaking about and challenging anti-Semitism from a genuine left perspective.
I mean, just to say, like, I think that the concern that I have, and like this is an honest concern, because I want a lot of what the left wants too, right? Like I want, and I see it slipping away in part because the left is, in my view, being drawn into a situation that is being put into place by those organizations that you're criticizing and not sufficiently changing the game. Meaning, like, in the same way that I think you're saying that folks who are believing the ADL and whatever other entities, that they're kind of marks, right? That they're being drawn into believing things that somebody else is putting out there in bad faith. My concern is that the left is fighting them. It's kind of like a rope-a-dope strategy, and the left is falling for it. And as a result, the people in between those two places are moving towards the right because they, it's kind of like the mirror image of what I've argued against happening by a lot of the mainstream organizations where they say basically on Israel, are you with us or against us? And young people are often saying, well, I know I'm not with you. So you set it up as I'm with you or against you, so I guess I'm against you. And in a way, what I'm worried about is that the left is doing the mirror image of that and offering a kind of very polar opposite sort of point of view and saying, are you with us or you're against us? And a lot of these now older people are looking at that and saying, well, I know I'm not with you because there's all this anti-Semitism or other problems going on that I can see with my own eyes, and you're just denying that. And so I know I'm not with you, so I guess I must be against you. And in that sense, I'm worried that the right is stronger, and I'm worried that more people are being sort of pulled in the direction of the right than are being pulled in the direction of the left. And it's in part because of the left's poor strategy.
I hear that, and in some respects, I'm sympathetic to it. I have my criticisms at time of certain organizations on the left, certain factions, certain segments, and certainly I think there are dynamics that are worth criticizing, worth thinking about in terms of their strategic efficacy. I'm not as convinced as I was a few years ago that there are rhetorical moves or strategic efforts that could have been more effective to move certain segments of the liberal community that should have been pursued. The strong piece of counter evidence that your position, I think, would have to wrestle with is what to make of the fact that today, looking at the polling, somewhere between 59 and 63% of Americans support an end to arms shipments to Israel. That even in the Jewish world, it's something like 62% of American Jews support sending offensive arms to Israel. That 77% of Americans support ending sales of arms to Israel. That we're about to elect, as we're recording now in October, next week, the presumptive favorite for the mayoral election is openly anti-Zionist Zoran Mamdani, whose major political formation, one could argue, was as the leader of the SJP chapter and is the son of an outspoken, very renowned scholar of Palestine. There is a lot of counter evidence that, in fact, the public opinion has shifted dramatically over the last 2 years to the left. Now, what that means in terms of politics, how that gets connected to organization, institutions, power is, of course, a separate question. But I don't think the jury is by any means out in terms of whether either some other alternative strategy would have led to Biden putting more pressure on, and I'm highly skeptical that some other strategy would have led to more than 77% of American Democrats supporting an end to military support for Israel. So I think that the strategy questions are debatable. What I don't think is debatable, and to come back to, I think, the main area of agreement between us, is I feel within my own political community, and I feel this even in myself, insufficient analysis for understanding, engaging, and addressing anti-Semitism in our politics and in our culture. And I think one of the things that I also take from Nuremberg's great book is the way in which anti-Semitism, or to be more specific in my language, the way in which anti-Judaism as a Christian idea continues to permeate and shape our political culture. And it would be very surprising if that were not the case. Obviously, the United States emerges out of a Christian political tradition, is in many ways shaped by Christian ideas, and anti-Judaism is absolutely central to Christian thought. One of the great achievements of Cold War American intellectual life is the creation of this idea of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Again, air quotes, the Judeo-Christian tradition. In many ways, Judaism is far more similar to Islam than it is to Christianity. But the whole idea of a Judeo-Christian tradition dramatically flattens the deep antagonism between Christianity and Judaism. In Nuremberg's analysis, the central idea of Christian anti-Judaism is that, number one, Judaism is about an attachment to the material as opposed to the eternal. So it's tied up with ideas of sexuality, with ideas of materiality, with greed, with money, as opposed to faith, grace, all those things that are eternal, heavenly, etc. So that's the central distinction. Judaism represents the earthly and the material, as opposed to the heavenly and the eternal. But number two, and I think crucially important for Nuremberg, is that Judaism is the name within Christian thought for a Christian sin. So to be Jewish is to be overly attached to the material, not attached to the eternal, overly attached to
in the sense
greed.
of, like, in the New Testament, talking about Pharisees as hypocrites being very deeply into legalism, as opposed to, like, just to get a little bit of the specificity of that.
Yeah, exactly. And then it gets picked up by Paul and then the early Christian thinkers, and then in the sort of move into modernity with the Spanish Inquisition, which was an inquisition of people who were described themselves as Christians, but were being persecuted for being Jews. Now, were there Jews that, people who were Jews who remained in Spain after the expulsion, who were tortured in the Inquisition? Absolutely. Were there also Christians who were tortured in the Inquisition for being Jews, again in air quotes, for being too Jewish? Absolutely. The point is, the whole idea of the Inquisition was ensuring that people who said they were Christians were not in fact Jews. And that idea, as Nuremberg shows, goes back, more than a millennia prior to the Spanish Inquisition, in the construction of the idea of Jews and Judaism as representing a sin in Christian society. Jews become representatives of broader social sins or broader social evils. Now, there's a crude, non-historical version of this argument that you see from people like Yossi Klein Halevi, that in which basically the idea is, okay, every society has things that it doesn't like, and so then Jews become the name for the things that it doesn't like. So socialist societies don't like capitalists, so Jews are capitalists, and capitalist societies don't like socialists, so Jews are socialists. And today we don't like racists, and so Jews are the ultimate racists. And so this is a kind of like eternalist graft of Nuremberg's argument. But what Nuremberg helps reveal is the way in which there are dynamics that we can see even specifically around looking at the politics of Israel-Palestine, where for many, Israel becomes the representation of American imperialism. Now, again, this is where things get really confusing, because on one hand, seeing Israel and Zionism as the manifestation of American imperialism is very narrow, because that is not the whole of American imperialism. The head of a left organization says, when Zionism falls, American imperialism will fall. To me, that's an anti-Semitic argument. American imperialism does not rest on the state of Israel. Is it also the case that the state of Israel is the most visible, manifest, and at this moment, violent extension of American imperialism? Yes. It is also the case that Israel right now receives more foreign funding than any other country. But it is not the whole of American imperialism. It can be hard to sort through how to insist on the centrality of American policy towards Israel within American imperialism, while also insisting that that policy is not the whole of American imperialism. And I think the place in which you see this most obviously is in someone like Tucker Carlson or Nick Fuentes, where the entire framework for thinking about American global power gets sorted through a lens that reflects an obvious obsession with Jews and Jewish power.
So I'm really appreciating some of the historical reflections and the contemporary reflections. I want to sit a little bit, because strategy questions came up, and they weren't about the Jewish left as much as the broader left. I am interested in schmoozing with you about the Jewish left. But I bring that up because you and I actually met to talk about college campuses. I was a college student. You were helping organize college students related to Israel-Palestine through the organization J Street U. And I remember some of our first conversations. It was you, me, and a couple others, and we were talking about like, okay, how do we make it so that J Street U chapters will be included in Jewish communal contexts on college campuses? And also more broadly, how will J Street as an organization be more included? Again, that's always what the word was, in broader Jewish national kinds of discourse. And I remember even sitting with you just before J Street applied to be part of the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations and really hoping that J Street would be accepted. And now today, you are no longer doing work that I would describe as like include us work. Like Jewish Currents is not trying to be, to my knowledge, it's not as if Jewish Currents is trying to get people who are mainstream rabbis or synagogue presidents, like people who have certain kinds of roles in the Jewish establishment to read it. It's like, let's be a voice, let's be a platform, let's be a conversation for folks who understand their Judaism in a different set of ways. And I think Jewish Currents has built up a really impressive niche for itself. And more than that, it has become one of a number of organizations that many of us look at as kind of a new rising Jewish left. That, look, there's been a Jewish left. It's not that this is a new creation. But I think in the same ways you described certain kinds of ideological opinion shifting recently, Jewish institutional affiliation has been shifting, and in ways that are noticeable, communities are starting to have, whether it's a small chavurah that they never had before, or a bigger synagogue they never had before, that identifies in some way as pushing against those norms that have been so core to Jewish life for a while. And so I guess on this strategy conversation, I'm kind of curious, like, where's Jewish Currents at in all of this? Where might we look to understand how we find some answers? Because I'm with you that, like, I don't have the answers either. By the way, like, people should check out Diaspora Alliance, which is an organization that's trying to think sophisticatedly about anti-Semitism through a different kind of lens. But, like, where does Jewish Currents and the broader Jewish left fit into this conversation? Because we'd all agree we haven't nailed it yet, but we also, for me, it's a we are building something a little more powerful.
Yeah, well, I guess I would start by saying that I came to feel that the strategy around inclusion was not going to be politically effective or organizationally transformative. When I was at J Street and we initially met each other, as your anecdote reveals, so much of our work was about making the case that we belonged within the framework of the Jewish community. So whether that was petitioning, campaigns, is actually when we initially met too, Dan, at the University of Chicago, right? So, okay, we want to be involved. We want, the Hillel to recognize the J Street U chapter at various different campuses. We want to be included in the Conference of Presidents. And of course, the condition for all of that within the American Jewish institutional world is to demonstrate that you are in fact pro-Israel. And so all of the framing of our work at J Street was to make the case that a Palestinian state was necessary for Israel, for Israel's survival as a Jewish democratic state. Now, there are a couple major problems with this, I came to feel, but one of them, just to stay on the strategy point, is that it severely constrains the kind of tactics you are going to embrace as your own. Namely, it's very hard to make the case that you are pro-Israel if you are advocating for limiting or ending aid to Israel. Hard to make the case that you are pro-Israel if you are siding with votes at the UN Security Council against Israel. And this is, of course, what J Street, until very, very recently, was extremely reluctant to do, because the entire strategic framework was about showing that we are part of the mainstream, and therefore there are certain guidelines, frameworks, assumptions of that mainstream that one has to demonstrate that they're committed to. In my view, this was going to make it impossible for the organization to advocate for the kinds of policies more and more I came to see as the bare conditions for anything changing, namely real pressure, real costs for a system of apartheid and dispossession for which there was ongoing impunity. So that was the central political problem. There was a social cultural problem, which was it turned out simply by being included, it was, in fact, often offered a kind of fig leaf to institutions to say that they were pluralistic without changing any of their positions or policies or where they were investing their resources. So I came to feel that the work of transforming the Jewish community was not going to happen through investment in becoming a part of the traditional institutions and that we needed to create alternative institutions. And I think the last 2 years have demonstrated, for better or worse, just how, if I want to be positive towards myself, I will say how correct I was. If I want to be negative, I will say how misguided I was to imagine that the inclusion could produce anything close to the kind of transformation required. And the evidence for that is just rampant. Look at the number of rabbis that signed this letter opposing, we're talking late October, right before the mayoral election. I don't know how many at this point, 1,200 rabbis have signed this letter about the threat that Mamdani poses to Jews and how we can't normalize anti-Zionism. Over the summer, there was a poll that Mamdani had support of New York City Jews between the age of 18 and 44 of 67%. Now, that's probably gone down given all the attacks. Let's say it's gone down 20%. Let's say it's gone down 30%. We're still talking about a huge amount of the New York Jewish community. And again, just taking New York, that is basically unrepresented in American Jewish institutional life. The article that we were both in recently notes that 4 in 10 American Jews believe that Israel has committed a genocide over the last 2 years. I don't know of any Reform synagogue in America where the rabbi will use that term, not to mention conservative or Orthodox. And yet 4 in 10 American Jews see what has happened and have concluded that it's a genocide. The gulf between where enormous numbers of the American Jewish community are at and where their institutions are at is so deep. And it's within that context that institutions like Jewish Currents, I think, are so important to begin to carve out an alternative for the many people who are seeking it and seeing that institutions that they look to as representatives of, moral courage and social justice have betrayed those commitments so severely.
One little note, and I know you weren't holding to this term super hardcore, but I've tried to start a literal spiritual practice with myself to avoid the word alternative for what it is that I do or what other it's so deep. Even a lot
We're
of
quoted by Ariel on this point.
Yes, and I'll put the show notes. There's an article where I say basically we got to just call ourselves Judaism and not alternative. I'm not saying that because I think you really mean it in a deep way, but just because we all slip into it. I really believe that by the numbers, we're not alternative. There are a lot of people that at the very least are unsure of where they are on Zionism in a way that is unreflected by Jewish institutions, and at most are actively sure that they don't align with those institutions. But so that's a side point. I wanted, before we went, to get to the last little piece of your Harper's piece, which, funny enough, it's about punctuation. It's about a hyphen. On some level, maybe this is a bizarre thing to love about someone's article, but you gave a reflection on whether one might use a hyphen in anti-Semitism or not that I found very powerful. I'm not going to say too much about it because I want you to, but I, for years, have been part of communities that actively don't use a hyphen. And I was pretty convinced by what you said that there might be something to think about here. And more than it's about hyphens or not hyphens, the points you bring up about why that hyphen could connect to bigger questions of how we relate to the fight against anti-Semitism and solidarity with other groups felt powerful. So I'd love to hear about that concluding piece of your article.
Sure. And thanks. I'm glad that it was provocative and resonated. I came across this distinction and also found it very powerful in Jonathan Judaikin's great book, Critical Theories of Antisemitism. Judaikin uses the hyphen in the title, and in his introduction gives explanation for why he and others are reclaiming that usage. And I, like you, Lex, in most of the communities I've been a part of over the last decade and more, have not used a hyphen, have used anti-Semitism as one word. In fact, in the Harper's piece, their style guide insists on a hyphen, but when I initially wrote it, I did not use a hyphen throughout. And the reason that I have not used a hyphen is because of the insistence that anti-Semitism uses Jews to perpetuate an anti-Jewish politics. as opposed to the hyphenated use of the term, which implies that there is in fact such a thing as a Semite, of which Jews are, that can be opposed. So that is to say that the use of the hyphen anti-Semitism with the hyphen, which is how the initial term emerged in the late 19th century, posited this idea of a unified racial Jew that was going to be opposed. And so to use the hyphen embraces in one's language the category of the Semite as a racially homogenous entity that actually exists, as opposed to what exists is the idea of this racialized subject. The racialized subject is not, in fact, in the world, it is strictly created by the idea of anti-Semitism. So that is why most scholars over the last number of decades have used the term anti-Semitism without a hyphen. What Judaikin argues is that, in fact, in its emergence in the 19th century, Semite referred to both Jews and Arabs, Jews as the internal other that needed to be expelled from the countries of Europe, and Arabs as the external other that Europe needed to be protected against. And anti-Semites were those who understood the threat that both Arabs and Jews posed and were moving and creating and building politics in response to that threat. Judaikin argues that we need to see the history of this term as one in which Jews and Arabs were linked together, and one in which both Jews and Arabs were seen as a threat. And I think the reason that this is so provocative and powerful in our contemporary context is because it is so obvious the way in which Arabs are in our current moment described in ways that are so similar to the ways that Jews were described in classical anti-Semitism. And again, we're on the cusp of the mayoral election in New York, and this is so obvious in the way that you see Mamdani being targeted in particularly the right-wing press. Muslim who's going to impose Sharia law, who represents this group that cannot be assimilated into America, this massive looming threat, all the kinds of language that were used in anti-Semitic politics to talk about Jews. And so the argument on which I conclude the essay is that we need to see the way that anti-Semitic politics is showing up is in reference to Arabs, in reference to Muslims, and in particular in reference to those who support Palestine. That is the position, and those are the subjects that are being declared as unfit, unwelcome, unable to be part of the national project. And of course, you see that most explicitly in someone like Mahmoud Khalil, who's a permanent resident and is expelled by the state for having views that cannot be assimilated into the national project. This is the logic and the dynamics of political anti-Semitism, but rather than the Jew being expelled, it's, in this case, the Palestinian who is standing up for Palestinian freedom. One of the ways that the hyphen can reshape our thinking is by seeing the way in which the dynamics of anti-Semitic politics are visited today on Arabs, Muslims, and Palestinians.
You know, Mahmoud Khalil is an interesting segue to my question, which in my mind had nothing to do with what we've just been talking about, or very little to do with what we're just talking about. But the two federal judges who had the Khalil case and ultimately resulted in him being released were my friends from college who were both Jewish, very serious Jews. Yeah. And to me, that was a Kiddush Hashem, a sanctification of God's name, right? The idea that, and they weren't doing that because they were, Jews. They were doing that because they were responsible federal judges who read the law and do what's, required or whatever, however they're influenced. I don't want to suggest that they're influenced by their Judaism. And yet I was very proud to see that it's not so clean. Right. It's not as clean as people might think that. Right. I also think that these are Jews. Yeah. I don't know, 100%, but I think these are Jews who care about Israel, love Israel, who and yet can still think for themselves and are not just caught in this political binary. Right. And so what I wanted to ask you about, just as a concluding question, is if we could sort of put a little bit on the side these questions of whether it's Israel, Palestine, or anti-Semitism, or any of these kind of things, and ask this question of, is there a kind of a positive program for Judaism that you have or that you dream of having? Because this conversation is a little bit in dialogue with a conversation that we're also having with Sarah Hurwitz, who recently wrote a book. And her theory is that why she wasn't exposed to a meaningful Judaism was because of anti-Semitism, because of all kinds of internalized anti-Semitism, and that Jews were kind of hiding who they were and felt shame about who they were. And so as a result, kind of gave her a very thinned out Judaism. And it got me thinking about the other things that we're very attuned to, and for good reason, whether it's Israel-Palestine or other versions of thinking about anti-Semitism, that I worry that we're spending so much time and energy working on those things, and rightly so. I mean, they're important things. But are those same people also working on Judaism, where something that I wrote recently says, my dream is that we shouldn't ask why be Jewish. We should ask why not be Jewish. It should be so powerful that nobody would even have that as a question. And I'm just sort of, I want to enlist everybody in that cause. I want everybody to be working hard on that cause and also on all these other causes. And I'm wondering if there's like a place for that in the left, and what is that place? And maybe it's happening in ways that our listeners don't know about.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that the creation and formation of new forms of Judaism, new forms of Jewishness is the most exciting thing that we can be doing on the Jewish left. There's other things that are important to do, essential to do, but we certainly need to be creating new and exciting and creative and compelling ways of being in community together. And I think there's a lot of stuff happening. I think that lots of people will answer this question in different ways, and I hope that Jewish Currents can be a home for both thinking through this question and also platforming and bringing people into experience of all kinds of innovative and interesting art and culture and ritual. And so I will just answer the question very personally. I have a version of the answer that there is a story that I think has taken hold in certain kind of Jewish American circles, an idea, and you can see something like this in like Mordechai Kaplan and others, where basically like the central insight of Judaism is around peoplehood and community as a way in which ideas of human rights, universal ideals get instantiated. And basically, according to this narrative, what Judaism brings to the world is the idea that universal ideas need communities in which they can be practiced and given shape in life. And I think that there's a lot that is true to that. Not so much, I'm not sure about the Jewish exceptionalism version of it, but certainly there's something quite true about the fact that we need communities in order to manifest our universal commitments. But I think at the most basic level, Judaism offers this very radical way of thinking about community politics in the context of ethno-states and state power that I think is the grounds for both a radical and an exciting and a creative and an imaginative way of thinking about community and thinking about politics. Now, how to square that view, which has a admittedly strong emphasis on halakha, with a secular orientation, which I have. I'm not halakhically observant, so it's a little bit, the question for me is, I have this fascination with Jewish law. I have certain aspects of it that I am committed to, but I think at the most basic level, Judaism as a legal tradition offers a framework for thinking about a very profoundly radical politics that I find both very exciting, and I find the basis for a left vision of what a Jewish future might begin from.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thanks so much for having me.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. As we close this episode, a few quick Judaism Unbouncements. A reminder that we have Shabbat Unbound, the next iteration of our year-long Shabbat service, where we dive deep into one prayer each month, looking at its meaning, singing in a few different ways, having a great schmooze about it. All that good stuff is coming up on December 12th. You can register by heading to judaismunbound.com/Shabbat. And we've also got Apocryphest, our Hanukkah initiative, where we enjoy this holiday through the lens of books of Jewish Apocrypha, books like the Book of Maccabees, like Judith, like many, many others for us that were not canonized, but which can be of meaning to us in our Jewish practice. So we've got an event on December 21st, a Zoom gathering to celebrate Hanukkah together, light candles, play some games, have a great time with our friends at the Torah Studio. All of that can be experienced by you if you head to judaismunbound.com/apocrypha, APOCRYPHA. Also, we really want to give a shout out to our Discord, our bumpin' place for Judaism Unbound related conversations. Unbounders from all around the world have joined. We are now significantly over 200 members in our Discord, and it's climbing by the day. You can join, talk about recent conversations on the podcast, talk about your experiences in our Yeshiva courses. You can send pictures of your pets when they're being especially cute. There's channels for all sorts of stuff like that. We hope you will join at discord.judaismunbound.com. The last thing we'll say is that we always appreciate when you're in touch with us as hosts, Dan and I, and you can do so in any of the following ways. First, you can head to our Facebook or Instagram handles. Both of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, you can head to our website, judaismunbound.com, explore show notes for this episode, and see lots of other goodies. Third, you can email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.